I've been coming to Tallberg, for 4 years now. And my background, just to give you some sort of context to this, I was a banker for 20, 25 years, so I was on the dark side. And about 4 or 5 years ago, or 7 years now, I tell you, time flies, I started working for an organisation called Ashoka, which is the world's largest supporter of social entrepreneurs, 3,000 social entrepreneurs in, 70, 80 odd countries. And the mission I had there was from Bill Drayton, was to say, how can we change the way that philanthropy is funded? And it was very obvious that there were these brilliant social entrepreneurs that had a difficulty in scaling, that they didn't have access to capital. So the issue that I've focused on for the last 7 years has been to say, as opposed to looking at a system that gives money away at minus 100%, or government that cascades money down, or then seeks for profit with social impact at plus 6%, how do you create collaborative structures? How do you bring the skills of modern finance into this marketplace? If you think what a foundation structure is, which is really how the vast majority of money, at least on the private side, is allocated, it is one fiduciary structure. It's a closed end, what bankers would call a closed end investment trust that gives 5% of its capital away. That's it, pure and simple. And there's a whole range of people within our sector, the not-for-profit sector, that believe that that is the only mechanism that society can allocate its subsidy, which to my mind is completely wrong. And unfortunately what that system does, it creates a very quite innovative sector at some levels, but it produces an inability to scale. And as a capital market, it is tremendously inefficient. And the secret to that, there's a phrase in our sector which is all the money goes to the front, which may be true. What people don't tend to tell you is the amount of time and effort they make to actually getting to ask you that question. And when you realize that all these people negotiate bilaterally, so one-on-one for capital, and they all invent their own individual metric to justify that bilateral relationship, you end up with a very large system, but one that is pitch marked by very high degrees of fragmentation. So I'll give you a couple of figures. In the United States, the market is, for social capital in total, is estimated, according to Stanford McKinsey, at roughly $1.5 trillion. But less than 0.007% of those entities have revenues of more than $50 million of revenue or more, and only 3.8% of them have revenues of more than $10 million. So it's a huge sector, pitch marked by very high degrees of fragmentation. The other thing about our sector is they're all very nice to each other, but the reality is we all compete with each other because the nature of capital that we're raising, we're spending 40, 50 cents on the dollar raising that capital, is unleveraged. What I mean by that, you don't, for example, go out and raise your mortgage every single year. Well, we do in our sector, we raise that capital. And it has no annuity. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you go and buy a printer, you buy that printer cheap, and then you're paying through the nose for the cartridges. If you're buying a Boeing aeroplane, you buy the aeroplane relatively cheap, and then they sell you spare parts. Our system is virtually the exact opposite of that process. So we have a very large sector with quite large amounts of capital involved, but it's very fragmented with no economies of scale, hence very inefficient in some senses. And also a mechanism whereby it's very inefficient of how it relates their capital. And then finally, it creates very high degrees of fragmentation. It means you have the social entrepreneurs who have that innovation, spending 50 cents on the dollar, raising unleveraged, unannuitized income. They are detached from the benefit that they create. And the community itself, the second stakeholder that we should care about, is also detached from the downstream economic benefits of that innovation that comes from that community. So as a system, it doesn't intuitively make sense then. It doesn't make sense for the corporates who want to be involved in this sector because there are no mechanisms. This whole for-profit, not-for-profit, and elements within the not-for-profit thing to think that the devil is the corporate sector. So there's no mechanism that allows the corporate sector to engage in this sector in real scale. And then finally, from government's perspective, we have created a capital market, and government's now shortage of capital, where this capital that they've incentivized by the tax system is unleveraged and unannuitized. Well, the crisis for government is how you increase that capital. And then on the converse side of the equation, to cut to the point, there's $650 billion worth of unleveraged, not efficiently allocated resource. And then on the flip side, government, because it is short of money, then outsources further in the United States $650 billion worth of social functionality back in the social system. But that's fragmented, again, as a function of its own tax policy. The fundamental point is this is a very large market, but pitch marked by very high degrees of fragmentation and very high degrees of inefficiency. So that's, if you like, the intellectual problem that I've been looking for about 6-7 years. And a number of things that I've been involved in, other than having the pleasure of working with the social entrepreneurs, certainly the Ashoka ones are brilliant, innovative people, and trying to help some of them to scale. Some of the models I've also been involved in are things like the limited liability company in the United States, the SELLP in the United Kingdom. That is a legal structure that allows different players, government, not-for-governments, not-for-profits, to collaborate within one single structure with goals and incentives aligned, each taking a different social economic return out of the structure going forward. So whereas a for-profit, not-for-profit system by definition separates them, this draws them together, and it gives the stakeholders a stake in that solution as it goes forward and moves to scale. And that's also a mechanism which we're trying to push in the United Kingdom around what's called the SELLP. The other reason it's important is because there's an awful lot of very creative, intelligent people in this marketplace that are creating hybrid structures. For those to work and scale, they have to have a cost structure that works. So to do that, you need, again, a replicable legal mechanism where government can play a role in terms of making that ease of replicability, where for government that is tax neutral to tax positive to the government because they don't want to pay out in the current environment. And for the community, it empowers that community directly because it is cheap and easy to do. So those are some of the legal structures that are now being talked about in the United States. We've passed, I think, 14 jurisdictions. It's before another 14. In the United Kingdom, certainly it's been discussed at governmental level. What you're doing there is the ability to capture the value that the sector creates. So I'll give you the example. In the United Kingdom and in the United States, and probably also in the rougher parts of Stockholm if they exist, the rate of reoffending of gang members is about 95%. And the reason for that is when these kids come out of jail, they're given $100 and say, don't come back. Well, they go down to the pub, first night drink it, and then they go and mug another little old lady, so they end up back in jail. That is hugely expensive to the British government in terms of police, probation, all the paraphernalia associated. In fact, the cost is roughly £50,000 a head, which is more than the top public school in the United Kingdom would charge. So if you can reduce that rate, big saving to government. And there's a whole range, again, of social sector innovation that says if you do X, Y, Z, and Z, it will reduce the reoffending rate, and the saving is there. The problem in the traditional model is you've got a government. Government's a fantastic idea, but whose taxes do I increase or whose budgets do I cut to do that? Very difficult to do. The foundation world doesn't provide the consistent funding. So under this particular structure, what happens is the government makes a commitment to pay a private investor a return based on the reoffending rate. So if the reoffending rate drops, that private investor makes a return of up to 13%. His opportunity under a grant model is giving his money away for a loss, a minus 100% return. So under this structure, he is making a return. And in fact, the quicker that the social objective is achieved, he makes a higher return. That injects the forces of competition, of creative destruction into the sector. From government, they're not making the payout unless there is a definable impact. So on the international sphere, it would probably create less corruption, and government is paying out of the saving that they're making. And for the other stakeholders, the social entrepreneurs, they're not spending 50 cents on the dollar raising their same money they have to do every year. That's one of the, I could talk about other innovations, but those are the types of innovations where in this particular case, you are creating the value of which you create. Now, the irony for our sector is that that amount is much larger than actually the investment that we talk about. We only really look at one side of the equation. We say, how much money do we have to raise to fund this particular program? Once you begin talking about these sorts of models, you begin to create the opportunity to think about how you should actually systemically collaborate together. Because if you're paying by the outcome, what it does is begin to force payers to collaborate and work together. So there's an additional benefit in this, in that it begins to force collaboration into the process. And as I say, that's just one of these types of innovative new legal structures, new financial structures that you're seeing entering into this market. All one is really trying to do is to say, if you look at traditional philanthropy, it's based on 1944, government knows best, let's cascade the money down. Well, in the rest of the economy, you haven't believed that since 1979 at least. Or alternatively, it is based on a financial fiduciary system designed in 1903. And essentially, that is an extremely inefficient way. So essentially what we're doing is saying, how do we bring the tools of modern capitalism for social endeavour? How do you hardwire that into the structure? How do you create collaboration between government, the private sector, and the corporate sector? It's about redefining the fundamental social contract, which is frankly what we have to do if we're going to try and address some of these major issues.